I think it's fascinating to examine why people are so worried about looking like a cult or having a cult sort of nuances or flavors to what they're doing, or avoid the way a cult might look. That to me is worth really looking closely at. So when people say, oh, this is a cult or that's a cult, oftentimes you'll see people in the OTO, for example, making fun of the Scientologists and talk about like some weird Scientology beliefs like Zimu or Xenu blowing people up in volcanoes or traveling around with souls frozen in ice cubes on DC-10s. And, in a way, I think this helps alleviate their anxiety about believing that some disincarnate Arab-looking figure dictated the Book of the Law to Crowley in a hotel room in Cairo in 1904. I mean, if the Scientologists believe in weird things, don't we believe in weird things too? It's just a way to kind of alleviate our anxiety over the strange things that we claim to believe. So I think that's interesting. I also think that the concern people have about cults really comes from their own allegiance, whether they know it or not, to the values of mainstream society, which sees totalizing or authoritative religious groups as inherently threatening. And this, to me, doesn't mean that they're kind of opposed to authority or totalizing experiences. It's just that their allegiances are to other kinds of authorities, the authorities of support culture, the authorities of the media, the authority of the values that they're taught in school or in college, rather than, they see that the people adhering to these other totalizing strategies are dangerous, but they don't want to look at their own adherence to totalizing ideologies at all. So I think that we need to examine that as well. One of the things that I think is really interesting when it comes to looking at the cult question is that cults actually can do things that the OTO can't do. Cults can set goals, cults can hold their members accountable, cults can own property. The groups that people tend to complain about as being cultic actually get a lot of stuff done compared to the OTO. The OTO isn't really publishing a lot of books right now, which it used to. The OTO doesn't own any property of note. These are all things that cults can do very well. On the other hand, what people complain about with cults is that there's a culture of fear. There's not a lot of dissent that's encouraged. People are worried about getting booted out. There's all these other, kind of unhappy making concerns. Well, the OTO has those problems, but it doesn't have any of the good things that these so-called cult groups have. So there seems to me like the worst of both worlds scenario here. We don't have the good things that cults have, and we can't do the good things that they do, but we certainly have a lot of the problems that cults seem to have. So how do we get out of that, and how do we address that? And I think that's significant. The other problem that a friend of mine used to point out to me at my old political job was any group that actually organizes effectively enough to make significant change in the world is going to be viewed as a cult by people. And he said, you have to just accept that that's going to be the case. And if you're so worried about being a cult, you won't get a lot done. And part of me thinks that the OTO isn't getting a lot done, that the Thelema community isn't a more powerful force in society because its members are so terrified about being seen as a cult. They don't want to make the same kind of commitments. They don't want to accept the same kinds of authority. The authority that they have doesn't want to make severe demands on people, and consequently very little gets done. And that trade-off seems acceptable to most of the middle class and lower middle class members in the organization. And you hear them actually say things like, well, we may not have buildings and we may not be very serious, but at least we're not a cult.
As if that's some kind of consolation prize?
Right. Is that your consolation prize? Does that justify the fact that the group looks so silly and lame in a lot of ways?
Yeah.
So what is that really saying?
So
where are your real allegiances if you're really worried about being seen as a cult? If you're really worried about cultic influences, where are your real allegiances? And one of the things that I find fascinating is that even people who aren't involved in the OTO but are sort of interested in the occult and kind of like watching the community, when you start talking about making strategic plans, taking the organization seriously, holding people accountable, setting goals, these people get really upset. Their attitude is, you shouldn't be doing that. And I say to them, well, would you have a problem if the Episcopal Church was setting goals? Would you have a problem if a Reformed synagogue was doing strategic planning? Why is it okay for these other religious groups to take their stuff seriously and have strategic plans and own property and hold people accountable? But why is it not okay for us to do the same thing?
Well, I think the reality is those organizations are closer to normative society's values. So if they end up becoming empowered, all they're going to be doing is pushing an agenda that will further society as it is. Whereas Thelema,
using the term cult is a delegitimizing term. It delegitimizes the religious group that's involved. If you say, well, they're a member of a cult, that means that the religious beliefs that those people have are not legitimate.
That's correct.
No one sees the Episcopal Church or Reformed Synagogue as being, not legitimate in the same way.
Right. When people consider Scientology or even Opus Dei as a cult, they're trying to diminish the legitimacy of it and paint them as some kind of non-serious or something that society should exclude or dismiss, not take seriously.
Exactly. And that's how the larger society makes its values predominant, is by excluding and diminishing groups that threaten or challenge it. And, the trade-off seems to be, I can be in the OTO as long as it's not a cult.
Right.
I can be a Thelemite as long as I don't take it seriously enough for it to be dangerous.
Right.
And the more you examine this look about what a cult really is or how a cult might be in Thelema, the more you see people's real anxieties below the surface about what Thelema is and what it really demands of them.
Well, let's go to that dangerous aspect. What is dangerous about it, and why do they see it's dangerous? Where is this idea that cults are dangerous? Where is that coming from?
Well, it's coming from the larger society, which doesn't want any threat to its dominion.
Right. And so the hegemony is seeing these other organizations that are vying for power, that are setting themselves up as these apparatuses of attention and empowering to people to be against the normative society. And so they're seeing the threat here, and they're going, this threat is bad, so we need to delegitimize them so people don't take them seriously.
Right. And it would be one thing if it was just people outside of the OTO who was doing this, but the OTO has so many people inside of it. I think its own leaders participate in this sort of delegitimization of its process. I think they've kind of made an interior decision on some level. The OTO is acceptable and Thelema is acceptable as long as it's not a cult and as long as no one takes it all that seriously, as long as no one makes serious sorts of commitments that would make it look like a cult.
Well, I think this is a problem for the OTO, but I think it's a problem for almost all of esotericism. Anytime you bring up magic or magical practices, all of a sudden, you don't really believe in that kind of stuff, or it has to be couched in some kind of quasi-psychological language that delegitimizes any kind of external manifestation for all of this
Or you see
stuff.
the academic approach, and this is what a lot of sort of middle-class and aspiring middle-class people in the OTO want to approach it. They want to approach it as psychology. They want to approach it as an academic discipline. I'm not an occultist in that I actually believe in what Crowley taught, but I study it as an academic.
Right. It gives
and
them
that
some
gives
form
you
of
the
distance.
trappings of the secular culture and the approval. We approve of people studying this stuff. We don't really approve of people believing in it.
Right, because if they believed it, that would actually be something that is contrary to our secular society.
Right, and potentially dangerous. And what's fascinating to me about this is that we're getting this not from just people outside of the OTO, although a lot of them I think are doing it too, but from people within the group itself. I mean, from the leaders of the organization, who you'd expect in normative circumstances to be pushing for more engagement, more involvement, more commitment, more accountability. Those are the very people who are the most anxious about actually creating an organization that would look that way. Because they're the ones often who got into the positions of power because they were the most normative, the most conventionally responsible, the most invested in society's values. And consequently, that's what the conflict and the crisis is.
Right.
So when they reassure themselves that at least they're not a cult, we don't have a lot of money, we don't take it really seriously, we're not publishing the books anymore, we don't own any property, but at least we're not a cult. At least we're not a cult. And the argument is, in order to get any of those things accomplished in a serious, purposeful manner, it would start to look like a cult, and that would freak people out, and they wouldn't want to do it anymore.
The OTO has an interesting problem where the members who are most into the material, it seems, are the ones who are the most disaffected from society and can't get anything done, whereas the ones who are least into the material and more middle class and established within society seem to be able to get things done in an administrative way. They're the ones who rise through the levels to become the administrators of the order, but in doing so, they remove themselves from the material. So what has resulted is this large bureaucratic organization that has lots of efficiency on the administrative level, but has no informing values, no connection to the literature, and just results in some kind of empty formalism.
Well, I think that's one aspect of the empty formalism. I'm not always convinced that the people who are the most invested in the material are unable to function in a larger society. I think that that's sort of a problematic assertion in that there are people who are very invested in the material who can function very well in society. A lot of those people have given up on trying to make the OTO serious because they're tired of dealing with the people who aren't interested in the material, and I can certainly respect that. I think a lot of the kind of kookier elements in the community, the people who, walk around in magical robes all the time or seem like kind of urban shamans on a certain level, those people I don't really feel are that invested in the material, mostly because I don't think they have the education and background to understand it very well. They're not the people constantly reading the text and studying them and showing us what they mean. They're not the people really committed to the higher practices. What they are is practicing a sort of folk magic, tiered response to the material that maybe they may be sincere about, but it doesn't really manifest in anything significant, which it would have to if they were really committed to the material.
Well, okay. Here's an interesting problem, or maybe some kind of paradox we have here. To really be able to engage in this material and get the abstract ideas and work with it, you have to be educated. But isn't the current educational system an ideological entrenching environment in which if you go and get an education, they're going to be pushing a very liberal, secular, humanist agenda, and don't a lot of people succumb to that ideology?
Yeah, that's a huge paradox and a huge crisis that has to be overcome. But the good news about that is that ideological paradigm, that secular humanism, is inherently nihilistic and is destabilizing itself, doesn't work, and doesn't satisfy people. If it worked and satisfied people, we wouldn't have the OTO at all. But in fact, on many levels, it's not working anymore. It doesn't produce real achievement and accomplishment. It's lame. It's boring. It doesn't excite anyone. It's not challenging. So consequently, the seeds of its own destruction and its own inner logic of nihilism, as Nietzsche and Heidegger would point out, are already self-evident. So, yeah, you do need an education, and yeah, you are going to get indoctrinated, but you're also going to see that indoctrination is a tremendous failure when it comes to practical, real-world issues. It just doesn't work.
But don't you think a lot of the people who are approaching Thelema and occultism from the distance of the academy, or who have gotten the degrees, have bought into the liberal secular humanism and normative society, and that's why they have a lot of the problems they have? Absolutely,
and I hope that those same people will begin to question their training and their indoctrination and begin to see why it's stupid. And that's one of the things that I really feel we need to help them with, is to reveal to them, hey, Crowley hated that. He thought it was stupid. It's not part of his teaching. Stop trying to reconcile your liberal secular humanism with Thelema. It's not going to work. And it's only going to result in dysfunctional organizations like the current OTO. In a lot of ways, I think we can look at the current OTO and see it as proof of the failure of exactly that sort of reconciliation attempt. It's just you can't reconcile those two things. So the good news is it's not working. They may be trying it, but it's not working, and it's not very challenging.
So the reason...
Look at some of your listeners, John. The younger people who are really interested in the material, have a lot of energy, really focused on it, they don't find liberal, secular, humanist occultism interesting. They don't find it challenging. They don't want to get involved with it. They reject it out of hand. That's a good sign.
Right, but they don't have the skills to really deeply engage in the material because they're lacking in education.
Right. Well, we're working on helping them with that.
So the whole point is to go to school, get an education, but don't buy the ideology, but get the skills so then you can really engage in the material.
And I think that's not as difficult as it might seem. It is a paradox, it is a problem, but we expect magicians to address paradoxes and problems and overcome them.
Well, I think that's a good stopping point for this podcast, and I appreciate you being on again, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
93,
John.
Thanks again to Keith418 for coming on the show. There's always mixed response to the shows that he's on. Some people love it, and as you get from some of the feedback we've seen, they appreciate the
comments and discussions that he and I have. And some people think he comes on the show too much. And others ask when he isn't on the show